So I don't know which, if any of you, was at the last session in July, but what I really talked about was some of the principles of psychological formulation, some of the theory behind it, and what a good formulation should or should not be. I suppose in the first instance, it would be good to hear from you what your understanding of psychological formulation is. So either in the chat or simply by unmuting yourselves.
I think like the formulation usually presents I don't know, when I say formulation, usually I think of Beck's formulation. I don't know why it comes to my head directly, and I think that it includes present problems, what might be triggers, past traumatic experiences, and as Ghufran said, it could include what to do for later on as well.
Lovely, thank you. Any advances?
If I'm allowed to comment as an external, as a foreigner, I believe formulation is type of deep diagnosis found by the aliens, psychologists, to try to understand the problem, but in a more deep way.
Thank you very much. History taking. Okay, so a formulation a good formulation should involve history taking. It may involve something like Dr. Beck's work. It may inform treatment. It is often used by psychologists, though even the DSM refers to formulation on page 1. Not that all my medical colleagues would necessarily know. But it is really about getting an understanding of the patient. It's a description, really, of the patient. So this is a bit of a recap of some of the stuff I covered last time, because I didn't know whether the attendees tonight would be the same as the attendees last time, and because I think that a gap of 5 months is a long time to remember this sort of thing. So formulation is really a potential explanation of why the problem is the problem and why it's a problem now. So why is a person presenting with PTSD now? Why is a person depressed now? Why weren't they depressed 2 years ago? Clinicians who always talk about theory-practice links like to think of formulation as being the peg that holds it all together. My opinion is that if a person comes to you and says that there are some problems they would like help with, what they're really saying to you is, I would like some problem solving from you. One of the things I often see in my clinical practice and in day-to-day life is that sometimes someone will have a problem and someone will offer a solution, but often the solution is not super well thought out. And the result of that is that the solution that a person is offered may be a solution to a particular problem, but it may not be the solution to their problem. You see that also in health services all the time. When someone is given a quote unquote prescription for something, but it isn't really for the thing that they need help with. So the way I conceptualize it, formulation is a description of the problem which allows you to clearly identify priorities for treatment. What treatment may look like will differ from clinician to clinician. And I'll talk you through some of my ideas around what constitutes a useful intervention in due course. But the key thing is that the formulation is what holds it all together. That is the evidence that you have tried to identify the problem or the problems that are contributing to this person's difficulties. I, of course, can't see any of your faces because I'm screen sharing and all your cameras are off. But if you would like to chip in at any point, please do. I prefer to chat rather than to talk at you for an hour or so. So do feel free to interrupt as you will. But is that a reasonable position to start from? That a formulation is there to aid treatment planning? Any objections so far? Okay. So this is the important thing. Psychologists always talk about thinking biopsychosocially. I've worked in psychology for a decade or more, and the reality is that most of us do not think biopsychosocially because most of us do not have a biological training. And there's not that much emphasis on biology. But I now work in neuropsychology. I work in stroke, in brain injury. I work with progressive conditions like multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's. I work with brain tumors. Biology becomes a huge part of my job almost immediately. And of course, there's an emerging evidence base, isn't there, around trauma and the biological, neurobiological, neuropsychological consequences of adversity, both early in life and later on in life. So a good formulation should be biopsychosocial. And I'll talk about that a bit over the course of this evening, but I'm not a neuroscientist. And so what I know is within my specific area of expertise, which is neuropsychology, not neuroscience. So this is really the nub of it. What's the problem? How did it come to be a problem? And in respect of your treatment planning, how are we going to minimize the impact of those problems on that person and their system? Because what you will soon discover about me is that I don't really believe in individual therapy. And I was trained, of course, to do lots of individual therapy, but I don't really do much individual therapy. And even when I do individual therapy, I spend most of my time trying to map out the system, the context the person lives in. So I work in East London in a very, very poor borough called Tower Hamlets. And it is a borough with a huge immigrant population. It is overwhelmingly Bengali. It is the third poorest borough in London. And the only reason that it is the third poorest and not the poorest is because Canary Wharf is in the middle of Tower Hamlets. So you have huge income disparity, huge inequality. And many of the people I see live in overcrowded housing. They don't necessarily speak English. They often have health issues. They will have often had to have taken quite treacherous journeys to come to the UK. And the immigrant experience is often very complex, of course. So the people I see do not have depression in isolation. They have depression in the context of poverty, racism, stories of migration, health issues, often very serious health issues because of the kinds of patients I see, and so on and so forth. So I rarely talk about the person, and I frequently talk about the system. And I'll be talking a lot more about systems later today. I'm going to skip over this because I think we haven't time for that this evening. So we have some more sort of theory here, some more guidelines around what formulation should offer. And really, all of this is simply designed to make formulation something which seems grounded in science and evidence-based. There is some evidence, there is some literature around the usefulness of psychological formulation. I gave you some of that literature last time. I'm not going to repeat it here. But I'm a little bit skeptical about how one researches what formulation offers in any kind of empirical way. And that's probably not a conversation for now, because I think formulation is useful, as I say. I think quantifying how useful it is very, very challenging. This is the more interesting bit. Some of the criticisms of formulation are that they are simply what clinicians think, and they override what the patient thinks. Another critique is that once a formulation is written down, it may as well be a diagnosis because it's set in stone because someone with lots of degrees wrote it. And there are ethical issues around formulations, because if I'm seeing someone for therapy and I have a really clear idea of their history, including early adversity, neglect, sexual abuse, racism, bullying, parental alcohol problems, and so on and so forth, whose right is it to share that information? Because in teams, we ask each other's opinion about cases, don't we? Every week in my team, we have an entire meeting where we can discuss clinical cases, which may be risky or may be complex, or where people need some help from the team. My job as the psychologist in that team is to help my colleagues think, to help them problem solve, to help them plan treatment. But if I believe that treatment planning is dependent on a good formulation, does that mean that I have to share my formulation with my entire team to plan that person's treatment? Do I have the right to do that? Is that ethical? I don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
We've been going on the kind of the basic practice that within the team, confidentiality is maintained. So usually, as in NHS teams, multidisciplinary teams, where we share information and each team member will bring their perspective. That's pretty much how it's worked in the teams that I've worked in, and that's pretty much what we're doing here. And what our practice here in terms of discussing with other, like with psychiatrists or physicians, like, or GPs or whoever might be involved in the care of the clients here.
Okay. Any other views?
I feel that the formulation is not like a diagnosis, or it's not like, as you said, it's not an ultimate truth, but it's more of a tool that helps us see the general picture, like see how things compiled up during the past couple of times until the patient reached coming to our clinic or to our door or asking for our help.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it does, although I don't know about your views about sharing with others, but it really does help when you take the insights of your colleagues about a case and they share some thoughts, especially when you're like still new and there would be some things that you wouldn't have thought to ask the client, or things that slipped your mind.
No, and I think that's right. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be case discussions. What I'm saying is that there has to still be a degree of carefulness with the patient's information. I'll give you an example. I'm working with a young person who presents with what we call a functional neurological presentation. So they present with weakness in the limbs and a number of other symptoms which look neurological, but do not seem to have any organic cause. So this person does not have multiple sclerosis. They have not had a stroke, for example. So I've been seeing this person, and it turns out that this person has a terrible history, actually, involving early parental separation, a long history of neglect. This person was emotionally abused by grandparents. There was early sexual abuse. There was bullying. There were at least 2 sexual assaults in adolescence. There have been several admissions to mental health units. There have been multiple suicide attempts. Now, my colleagues do ask me what my opinion is of this patient, because we work as a team and several of us are seeing this person. But my view is that for me to share all of that information without very good reason actually would be very questionable. Because it is possible to talk about the patient and the difficulties they've had without giving such sensitive information. So I could say, well, this person had an unhappy family life, difficult relationships with parents and grandparents, some early trauma, and then some quite serious trauma and long contact mental health services. And that can still give you a picture of someone who's very traumatized, who maybe doesn't trust people, who maybe hasn't had very, very good experiences of people in power, who maybe is quite lonely. But it doesn't require me to give all of the information with all of the detail in quite an exposing way. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. It's so you mean to like try and be as concise as possible, like to discuss the case, but still try and be like as general as possible.
Yeah, I think when patients give us this information, they're giving us very sensitive, very privileged information, because they wouldn't share this with everyone they meet. And our job, I think, is to treat that information gently and remember that it was probably incredibly hard for that person to share their story with me. Because if you can imagine for a moment sharing that, if that had been your story, and if you could imagine sitting in a room with someone you didn't know very well, telling that story, that will be a deeply difficult, probably quite shameful experience. And we hear these stories every day, that's our job. But patients live them every day. And so the information that we as psychologists, psychotherapists, counselors, psychiatrists, whatever, the information we hold about patients is some of the most important information they could give us, some of the most sensitive, and they've trusted us with that. So our job is to make sure that we use the information carefully.
Masuma,
Hmm.
I have a question. I'm thinking about in supervision. In supervision, when I take a client to supervision, I believe it's probably different than what the setting that you are talking about. Because in supervision, if there is sexual abuse, I need to say that because working with sexual abuse will be different. Or trauma, specific trauma, let's say complex trauma, will then working with that aspect will be a different way of working.
Yeah, I mean, supervision is a completely different scenario. You know, clinical supervision has to be upfront.
Okay.
But there is a difference between one-on-one or two-on-one supervision and sharing all this information in a room full of 10, 15, or 20 professionals. And so that's what I mean. The information, the formulation should be on a need-to-know basis, so that patients' private information does not accidentally become the public property of health teams.
Okay, so what is the purpose of sharing a client in such a big group?
So it's very common, actually. So the team I work in, for example, and this is not a very big team, the team I work in is about 15 people, 15, 16 people. And it's a mixture of speech therapists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, nurses, psychology, and so on and so forth. So it would not be uncommon for a patient or a number of patients to be discussed in a forum that large. And actually, quite often I have to say, well, maybe this is a conversation for the 3 or 4 people involved in the treatment. This is not all to be discussed with the entire team. I think healthcare services can sometimes forget that information may not be entirely confidential, but it can still remain on a need-to-know basis. These are more conversations really about sort of professional ethics and so on. What I'm saying really is be careful with your formulations and maybe think about how you would want your information to be shared if you were using the services that you provide. But
that makes sense.
You know, these are wider topics really for ethical discussions.
Thank you very much.
So, on the topic of ethics, sometimes we will have a formulation of someone that the patient disagrees with. And even though the idea is that formulation is not set in stone, is not an ultimate truth, usually clinicians have more power and influence than patients. And so the formulation you write down can be influential, and it might not be right. And even if it is right, people don't always want to hear, you know, what that sort of formulation might be. There's also evidence that just because we understand why someone's presentation is the way it is, just because we understand that there may have been trauma, adversity, and so on and so forth, that doesn't necessarily make us any nicer to our patients. You know, we can still be quite coercive, we can still be quite punishing in the way we work with them. And so that is also worth remembering. There is an idea in some circles that formulation allows clinicians to develop empathy with patients. The evidence on that is very mixed. It's worth remembering, of course, that many clinicians work in underfunded, overstretched environments with too few staff and too big a caseload. It's very hard to remain empathic and compassionate in that regard. So this is a very basic CBT model, which many of you, I imagine, will be familiar with. So with, you know, the idea is that your thoughts affect your feelings and your behaviors, and that you might have beliefs about yourself, the world, and the future. And these can sort of stem from very, very early life, early interactions, early relationships, and so on and so forth. That's a sort of CBT formulation that most people are quite familiar with. Again, you'll probably be quite familiar with the 5 Ps, so I won't go through this in too much detail. But the idea is that you can effectively drill down someone's problems into these factors. I went through this last time. This is really just to be a memory aid. So I'll not go through this in too much detail. But presenting problems is clearly why someone is coming to you at this point. And so the example I used this time was someone who was struggling at work with some work-based anxiety. And with CBT, we take a careful eye and look at biology, physiology. I went through an example in a bit more detail, looking at potential triggers, potential core beliefs, early experiences, which may have made someone vulnerable to these sorts of difficulties, and potential protective factors, which of course are vitally important. I don't intend to go through this in any great detail unless you would particularly like me to, but I would imagine that most of you are quite familiar with this model. Is there anyone who is not familiar with this sort of model or this kind of explanation for difficulties?
Just checking with everyone. Feel free if you want to have a revision of it. I know we've done this, but if anyone wants Masuma to go over it again. Okay, it looks like we can carry on, Masuma. Thanks.
Great. So, tell me, what sort of presentations do you work with? Who do you work with? Where do you see them? If you wouldn't mind just one by one telling me.
I'm currently working with 2 clients. One of them has trouble with eating, and the other one has trouble with intrusive thoughts related to najasa and tahara.
Okay, thank you very much. And where are you working with those people?
So they are in Iraq, and I give them sessions via Zoom or WhatsApp call.
Thank you.
Video call.
Okay.
And the others, if you would like to give your past or present clients, just to give Masuma some idea.
Are we talking about the clients that we see at Al-Ataba?
For me, I'm working in Iraq in Basra. We work with many cases like PTSD, with OCD, with addiction, with this is above 18 and under 18. With we work with the child. Those we have sexual problem. We have depression. Many cases of depression. We work with every cases because we see children and we see adults. So many cases with all the diagnoses we work with them.
Lovely, thank you.
Both referred from the psychiatric.
Sure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any advances?
Sorry, are we talking about clients that we see at Al-Ataba or just in general?
Either.
Well, I see about, I have 3 clients from Al-Ataba. I have my private practice and I work in a school. I see children. Clients from Al-Ataba, I'm working with grief, OCD, complex trauma, depression, anxiety.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So it sounds as though you're all seeing complex cases because, I mean, I've never really seen a sort of simple depression. I've certainly never seen a sort of a simple case of OCD. And trauma is usually very complex, of course. So the conventional way to have done this talk would be to get this far and then present to you a number of models, number of formulation models, looking at things like social anxiety and looking at things like depression and panic attacks and OCD and PTSD. Now, I could do that, but actually my suspicion is that if you're already doing this work, you're already doing this formulating. So what I thought I might do actually would be to think about some of the more social and political aspects. Because, as I said earlier, I don't really believe that problems exist in people. I believe that problems exist in structures, in families, in systems, wider systems. After I trained as a clinical psychologist, I did some training in family therapy. And one of the phrases used most often in family therapy is, the person is not the problem is the problem. And it sounds simple, but the difficulty is that when you take something like this, what you're really doing is internalizing the person's problems. Now, a formulation like this is extremely simple, and people are rarely this simple. But if we look at this person's core beliefs of being sort of worthless and unlovable, you don't develop those sorts of core beliefs in isolation. You develop them if you experience an absence of worth and an absence of love from other people. It's all relationships, isn't it? It's all relational. If you have beliefs that if you do everything right, people will like you, well, that, again, you're not born believing that. You learn that. Where do you learn that? Well, you learn that probably from your parents. You learn that quite possibly from other people in your system. And you may well learn it from the political and economic context that you live in. You know, we live in late capitalism. We live in a system which prioritizes success, which encourages us to trample all over other people, which sees people as being no more than what they can produce, you know, where they can be productive members of society, whatever that means, and really reduces people to what we can get out of them. It's not really a system which is gentle or kind or which allows people to be different. It's a system which pressurizes people to conform and to achieve. It's no surprise, is it, that, well, I don't know about you, but it's no surprise that so many of the people I see have deep-seated feelings of worthlessness, of failure, believe that the only way to have value is to work and earn a living. These are very, very capitalist ideas. They've taken much stronger hold in the last 40 years or so. And my opinion, you may disagree, is that it's no surprise that we have had such an epidemic in recent decades of depression, anxiety, so on and so forth.
I agree with you a lot, and sometimes the patients themselves would say that the problem started from the outside. Like, yeah, they would tell you, you know, like it wouldn't be like it wouldn't be something that like you discover or they think it's their fault. Like many of them, they are struggling because of things that happened from the outside, wars, all of these things, criticisms, harsh standards, all of these things.
Yeah. I mean, you guys work in Iraq. What would Iraq be if it hadn't had so many wars over the last 30 or 40 years? Would the people you see need your services? I don't know. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't help them. What I'm saying is that we cannot locate the problems in the people. They're not you know, in psychology, there's this really big idea in the UK, certainly, and probably in the US, about resilience. This idea that if you have two people in terrible circumstances and one becomes depressed or anxious and one doesn't, well, obviously the one who doesn't is more resilient. And what we really need to do is find ways to make that weaker person who's depressed and anxious more resilient so they can cope with terrible circumstances. I disagree entirely. I think we should stop talking about how we make people more resilient and actually stop making life hard for them instead. And this is, of course, where my systemic thinking comes in. So, you know, I'm not going to talk through these models. I think they are fine. If you would like copies of these, you can have them. To be honest, each of these presentations is an entire lecture in itself, so I'm not going to go through them. But I thought I should put them in there just in case. Is that a question? Or is someone unmuted?
Comment. Sorry.
A comment. Yes, please.
Yeah, like what you said, I believe like to be more realistic, as if we say the problem starts from the system, but in reality, we can't remove the source of the problem, which is the system. So if we need to help these people, to have both sides, work on both sides, to try to make some enhancement to solve some problem with the system, which we really like realistically, we don't think that we will solve it immediately. So to have balance, try with the system, in the same time, try with people, as you said, to be more resistant for that influence from the system. So for me, what I understand from resilience is to be more like protected from the influence of system. So to have the balance on both sides, work with the system and with the individuals, because if we focus on the system alone, the chance that you will solve it soon is really weak, as you know. But still, it is you need to work with it. At the same time, to not waste time with a system that you have to work with like individuals to train them to be protected from the system's mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah, look, you know, I'm not saying that I think therapy doesn't work. I do therapy. I don't really do CBT. You know, and we know that CBT works at best for half the people. And for the people it doesn't work for, it just doesn't work for them. And actually, you know, you need a different approach. But I do not believe that we will stem the tide of depression, anxiety, and so on by offering one-to-one therapy. I don't believe that. Because I believe that the political, economic, and social circumstances we grow up in, you know, it's a globalized world. Neoliberalism, capitalism, and all their evils have penetrated every corner of the world, pretty much. And individual therapists probably cannot stem the tide of that. We can try to reduce individual distress, and that is valuable, but we need to be thinking bigger than that.
Masuma, just to let you know that there are some comments and questions coming up on the chat. Can you see the chat?
I can indeed.
Okay, thanks.
I will talk about the approaches I think are useful and interesting in a moment. What I should probably say is that you may or may not agree with much of what I say today. You don't have to agree. I believe in pluralism. But I do think that the psychological therapies have found themselves to be sort of infected by neoliberal ideas. So I'm a clinical psychologist. Annie is training as one. I'm sure she will have similar experiences to me, whereby it's incredibly hard to get complex patients good services these days. The secret, of course, is that all patients are complex. People are not simple. They don't fit into boxes. They don't fit into these models, I don't know if that's your experience, Annie, that people don't fit into models and you can't get them the help they need often, and that you're often restricted in what you can give them, and you have to prove you're doing well and managing their symptoms, even though their symptoms may well reoccur, because we know that people's symptoms do reoccur, and if you tackle the root cause. Is that your experience of offering therapy, Annie?
So I would go with exactly what you're saying in terms of very rarely do these, beautiful looking formulations neatly fit what we see in therapy, with the patients in front of us. So yeah, the complexity is really, like you said, there's no simple case. There's no simple depression, simple anxiety. All cases are complex cases. I guess what we're thinking here is grappling with, and some of these comments also have said that, and something Abdullah said earlier is what about what we can offer in a system which is set up to offer individual therapy? How much use, is there effectiveness in that, in offering individual therapy, when we have a context of not being able to change the system?
You can change the system in surprising ways. So, I've been qualified some years now, and I sometimes say to my trainee psychologists that if my supervisors from my training saw how I practice psychology now, I don't know if they would pass me. Not because I think I'm doing anything unethical, but because I'm not doing anything that my training taught me to do. So my training taught me, largely speaking, to do individual therapy and maybe run some groups. And if I'm honest, I don't know how effective a lot of my therapy was. I remember once seeing a lady who had OCD. She'd had it for quite some time. And I did what I thought was some brilliant exposure and response prevention work. Brilliant work, I thought. I took her to places that made her anxious. I'd done a hierarchy of situations, we chipped away at it. I discharged her. I thought I'd done fabulously well. 3 months later, I caught up with my supervisor for lunch. I said, I was pleased with how that case went. Oh, he said, she's back on the caseload. And that's not unusual. Things like OCD are very, very hard to treat. But I was quite young and quite naive. I didn't really know that then. It was quite dispiriting. Thinking back, there were probably lots of people I saw then who maybe I didn't help as much as I thought I had. And so now I do individual therapy. So that young person I told you about earlier with the neurological problems that are not organic, are almost certainly trauma-based, I am seeing that person for a piece of relatively long psychological therapy. And I hope it gets us somewhere, because I think what this person needs is a trauma-based approach, but not CBT. They need to find a way to integrate their story and talk through their trauma experiences, which are causing them lots of problems, and hopefully to find some sense of control over their life again, because they haven't had much control over their life for an awfully long time. So I do one-on-one psychological therapy. But systemic work comes in all shapes and sizes. I'm seeing a young man at the moment who again has a neurological condition, which means he has weakness and pain, mainly in his legs, and it can affect his back and so on. And he was referred to me because he was depressed and having difficulties adjusting to his diagnosis. But when I assessed him, he didn't actually present as depressed. He didn't really have problems adjusting to his diagnosis. His problem was that his college was not being supportive of his disability. And so they hadn't arranged transport, so he couldn't get to school, so he's missing lessons. And they hadn't made any attempt to make proper adjustments. So he needed longer in his examinations, and they wouldn't give him longer, and they wouldn't give him a chair he could sit in for 2 or 3 hours. So caused lots of pain, caused him lots of fatigue. So my intervention was to have a meeting with the school and say, look, you have a legal obligation to support this young man to access education. That is his human right. And that is what you have to offer him. The second part of my intervention, again, remember this is a man from a very poor part of London, a bright young man, but a poor man, and a young man who's had lots of bullying because of his disability and who lacks some confidence. He lacks confidence because people have treated him badly. But he's a bright man and he wants to go to university and do well, but he's concerned that university will treat him as badly as his college have. So he is terrified that he'll go to university and they won't support him and they won't help him and they'll make it really hard for him to study. And all he wants to do is get a good degree, get a good job, and have a nice life. He's not really interested in anything else. He's, he's a lovely young man. But because he's so worried about universities, he intends to go to the local university because he has one friend there who has told him that they will help him with his disability adjustments. Now, he can go to this university if he wants to, but he's going there out of fear. And it is also, it's a fine university, but he's bright and he could go somewhere much better. And if he goes somewhere much better, that means he will have much better career prospects. And it will mean that he may have a very, very different kind of life. And so the second part of my intervention is to get this young man linked in with a careers advisor who can help him to build some confidence in going to a university that is not the local university, who can help him write a good personal statement for his application form, who can help him with interview prep, and who hopefully can give this man a very different trajectory, and with it, give him some confidence. That is a systemic intervention. I was not taught to do that kind of thing when I was training at university.
I love this. I think this is what we actually need.
I spend a surprising amount of my time trying to get people rehoused. Because for many of my patients, their disability would not be a problem if they were in appropriate housing. The number of people I see who have mobility impairments because of multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's or whatever, and they're living on a flat on the 3rd floor with no lift and they can't get out, and their wheelchair is too big for the house and they're just stuck in one room. They're not depressed. They're badly housed, The housing is the problem. They're not depressed. take them out of terrible housing, put them somewhere where they can get out, where they have some independence, they have some quality of life, they have some dignity, almost always, magically, the depressive symptoms reduce. They're the kinds of interventions that actually make a difference to people's lives. I can't therapy you out of bad housing. No amount of therapy is going to give you enough food to eat if you haven't got money. Charities fill the gaps. So in the UK, we have a terrible poverty problem, particularly in the last 10 years because of the economic crash and the government's economic policy. And charities are feeding people because people cannot afford to buy food because the cost of living has skyrocketed and salaries have effectively dropped. Charities fill in the gaps all over the world because the systems, the governments that we largely, but not always elect, hold all the power, all the money, all the influence, and they don't let us get it. And that has worsened over the last 40 years. Neoliberalism has made income inequality significantly worse than it was in the 1960s or 70s. Can we take down the entire economic system in one go? No. But can you agitate bits of the system in specific ways to make life fractionally less bad for your patients? I'm not even talking about sort of magically making everything better. You know, we need to know what our limits are. I cannot fix my patients' lives. I cannot fix all their problems. Can I make specific bits of their lives fractionally less bad? And can I think about what needs to be prioritized? Because if I can do more good by trying to get someone rehoused, that is my job. And if I can do more good by trying to get someone into a better university and give him more opportunities in his life, that is my job. But if what my patient needs really is to be able to talk through their intensely traumatic experiences with someone who will not abandon them, who will not criticize them, and who will not make them feel ashamed, that is what I must provide. But you only know what you need to provide when you've done the formulation.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
As what you say, as if I understand you well, that you treat your patient as a component. For example, even his PTSD, but according what he complained of, for example, if he depressed, we make him getting active. If he anxious, we make for him relaxation. If he have a problem, we make solve a problem. If he has a bad memory, so we talk about difficult memory and thinking in a different way. That is what we call a component. Yani, we treat in a component, and that is what is called theta therapy. If you hear about it, theta, which is component element therapeutic approach. You understand me?
Yep. You know, I think it's possible to have more than one intervention at a time. So it is absolutely possible to help someone manage their symptoms whilst simultaneously trying to do something with the system, with their psychosocial difficulties. The social is also important. Of course, though, if someone is highly agitated, highly stressed, having panic attacks, of course, interventions that focus on their body and their symptoms are important. We know that behavioral activation can be incredibly effective. Firstly, because it allows the body to be physically active. Secondly, it allows for experiences of success and enjoyment. Thirdly, because it allows people to engage with the world around them and have social interaction. Those things are all important. But the behavioral activation is not really one intervention, it's multiple interventions because it has multiple positive outcomes. But you can do behavioral activation whilst also saying, okay, so how are we going to help you get through this difficult social situation? How are we going to help you with the fact that you haven't got enough money? A big bit of my job is helping people to apply for benefits. You know, in the UK, the benefits system is very, very hard to negotiate. It's very hard to get disability benefits. And even outside my NHS work, people know that if they need an assessment and a letter to get benefits so that they can afford to eat and pay their bills, they know that I will write an assessment letter for them. Those are the interventions that are important, because everyone needs to eat. Everyone needs housing. Everyone needs some kind of financial security. And actually, you need to tackle those things really before someone can engage in psychological therapy, because you have to have enough physical and psychological safety to engage in therapy, because therapy is hard. Therapy is extremely challenging. And you need to have enough protective factors around you. And Abdullah, what you were saying earlier about helping people get those protective factors, well, housing, food, and money, they're some of the big ones. So I don't think we disagree. This is a sort of formulation template I use. So this, you won't find this in any book. I made this up myself. So until very recently, I worked on a ward with patients with neurological problems, mainly stroke, but also traumatic injuries, car crashes, those sorts of things. And so this is really a longitudinal formulation. It doesn't look like one, does it? But it's a longitudinal formulation. So we're talking about pre-injury factors, medical issues, housing issues, so on and so forth, early experiences. And then we're looking at coping strategies. Because brain injury will be remarkably common amongst the people you see in Iraq, maybe diagnosed, maybe undiagnosed. But it's important, and that's why I included it here, because this is not a conventional formulation template. When you have formulation teaching, you don't usually have people talking about things like brain injury. But of course, our behavior and our thoughts and our feeling are influenced to a great degree by our brains. And so if we have brain injuries for whatever reason, of course that will affect our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So this formulation really said it looks at long-standing factors, including, as I say, health, early experiences, and so on and so forth. And it also looks at coping strategies. And the reason it looks at coping strategies is because when someone has a brain injury, you can be fairly confident that their way of coping with the brain injury will be very similar to their pre-injury coping strategies, but probably they'll be a bit more pronounced, they'll be more exaggerated. And so from that, you can then think about what some of the challenges might be. So I'll give you an example. I had a man in his 60s who had had a stroke, and it was a left-sided stroke. So he had some communication impairments, and he had right-sided weakness. This was a man who grew up in a very poor part of London. He had lived on a council estate in great poverty. His father had been an alcoholic, he'd been a drinker. Life had been very hard. So this is my cat. Life had been very hard for this man when he was growing up. This was a man who did not have many experiences of success in life. He had an unhappy marriage. He tried multiple times to set up a business. He was self-employed. He didn't have any qualifications. And every attempt to set up a business was unsuccessful. He ended up in huge amounts of debt. he was quite racist. And his way of coping with all of these disappointments in life was to get angry, to be abusive, and to drink. He had a child who had no contact with him, and there were other complexities in that child's life, which I won't go into. And this man's wife died shortly before he came into hospital. So this was a man who did not have any friends, who did not have any family. The little family he did have didn't really like him. And so he had this idea that was really him against the world. And it had been really, he hadn't had much backup. But then he had a stroke, a really substantial stroke. Unsurprisingly, the treating team on the ward found him quite difficult to work with because he was a bit aggressive. He was quite argumentative. He was very stubborn. He could be very rude. He didn't really cooperate. Entirely unsurprising given what we knew about this. This was a man who life had been quite cruel to. He wasn't very happy with life, wasn't very happy at all. Then he had a stroke and suddenly he was quite disabled. And there were conversations about whether he should go into a care home or not. And obviously he hated that. And he didn't talk to us about not wanting to go into a care home. He shouted at us entirely predictably. And so when you've got this picture, when you have a good enough idea of the premorbid issues, the premorbid coping strategies, and the cognitive and behavioral impairments, actually, you can then very easily predict possible challenges during hospital admission or during a rehab episode, and then think about what may help and what may not help. This might be the sort of template which could be useful for some of the people you're working with. I know that you're not working in inpatient units, but it doesn't really matter. The point is that really the cognitive and neurobehavioral impairment section is actually no different to the critical incident box in a Beck formulation. But really, the way I think about it is you are looking at these difficulties through the lens of the critical incident. And when you look at the history through the lens of the critical incident and the current impairment, you will almost always get a good idea of what some of the challenges might be. As I say, you won't find this in any book, it just exists on my hard drive. But for something that was basically drawn by hand on a piece of paper one day, it's surprisingly useful. The advantage of a template like this is you can present this to non-psychologists, non-psychotherapists, non-counselors, and they understand it. So it's just a series of boxes with a series of arrows. So if you're going to present a formulation to your colleagues, a template like this actually makes an awful lot more sense than this, or this, or this. Formulations should be as simple as possible if they're to be as useful as possible, because almost no one can really follow that. And a non-specialist probably can't make much sense of that. It's just very overwhelming. So when you're presenting your formulations, the simpler the better. I've been talking for some time. We've got about half an hour left. Are there any questions, comments, or otherwise at this stage?
Quick question, please.
Yes, please.
So I love the work that you're doing on the system and changing that systemic approach. I really like that. But I think for me, when I'm looking at it, it's working on both fronts. It's working through with the individual on a therapy level, but also on a systemic level, if that's what you want to call it. But my issue is there a chance that you're taking that autonomy away from them, or changing their situation? Does it necessarily change how they actually feel? Because an example that I would give is if somebody is struggling financially, for example, if they were to suddenly be given money or win the lottery or something, what we've seen in research is actually people who have won the lottery actually go bankrupt within a space of a year, so many of them, because they've actually not grown with that money, they've not developed internally. So when suddenly you change a situation for them, they're not equipped to deal with that. So while the system needs to be changed for sure to help with some of those symptoms, but if we don't actually do the internal work and the inner work, does it actually relieve the patients from what they're going through?
It's a good question. I mean, no, it's a good question. I suppose I'm not talking about massive sweeping changes. I'm not talking about going from a 1-bedroom flat with damp and rats to a 12-bedroom mansion, you know. I'm talking about the basics that allow people to live a dignified life, you know, the basics that you and I would want for ourselves and the people we love, and probably even the people we don't like very much, you know. I'm talking about the things that allow people to live in a way that they have self-respect. I think you're right. Internal and external need to be done at the same time. And of course, you can't always fix the system, you know. There are plenty of people on my caseload who really need rehousing, but I don't have any control over the housing list. I can write a letter, I can fight social services, I can advocate for my patients as much as they would like me to, and I am able to, but ultimately, I don't have any control over that. I think the point, though, is that if we have a systemic formulation, we know where we need to be pushing to get change. That doesn't mean that you can't help someone to live a moderately better life in their current context. But it does mean that we need to take, you know, it's complicated, isn't it? And I'm not going to pretend I have all the answers. If I did, I'd probably be a more effective clinician. But my worry is that the psychological professions, I use that term very loosely, is that we have become very narrow in the way we approach people's problems. And with the individualizing of distress and the idea that you have 6 sessions or 8 sessions or 12 sessions according to a predetermined model, we're really failing to understand that people are complex and sophisticated beings. And you know, the kind of people I work with, I really am talking about the most inadequate, terrible, undignified housing, for example. Talking about, you know, I'm talking about a patient who I saw, I don't know, 5 years ago, I suppose now, more than that, a number of years ago, a lady with a learning disability who had had her benefits stopped. And she didn't understand the letters she was getting. And so she'd been buying food on credit from the local shop. And then it got to Friday and there was no more credit and she had no food in the house and no money. And she wouldn't have any money for at least another 4 or 5 days. And so her options really were to either beg for food or to go hungry for 5 days. You know, I'm talking about that level of systemic oppression. I'm talking about that level of systemic injustice. Those are the things I'm talking about, really. I'm not talking about someone like that suddenly having a fortune. I'm talking about having enough food to live a humane life. But she was referred to me for panic attacks. And she did have panic attacks. She had panic attacks because she lived in quite a rough part of town. and she very obviously had a learning disability. And people in the local area were quite unpleasant to her and were quite abusive towards her and quite aggressive towards her because she was clearly quite vulnerable. Now, they are systemic problems. That's really about how our society perceives disability and difference, and whose life is seen as worthy and whose life is not seen as worthy. I can't magically fix that. She again needed rehousing to a nicer part of town, but what she really needed when I saw her that Friday afternoon was just some food in the cupboards. The panic attacks were not a priority. And that's the thing. When you start to think like this, you can quite rapidly start to feel a bit helpless because systems are big, aren't they? And it can be dispiriting. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because I think what we need to do as professionals is keep the system in mind and use the power we have to influence change, to fight for change.
I think what you're talking about also reminds me about Maslow's hierarchy. And then when we work with our clients, we want to work on the top of the hierarchy usually, like want them to reach self-actualization, to know their potential, all of that. If the other things are not available for them, it's gonna be difficult to provide them therapy that's gonna be effective.
Yeah. And, you know, we just had a question saying if these things are not within our gift, is any point starting therapy? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't, you know? But you can't just discharge people off the caseload because you can't help them. Well, you could. It probably doesn't do that person much good unless you try to offer them something or signpost them somewhere that could help them. It's a really difficult tension. And, you know, within clinical psychology, the ideas I'm talking about, to some people, are quite radical. I don't believe any of this is radical. I believe that in a profession full of highly qualified people who are often very privileged and who are quite well paid, to be frank, I think we have a duty to fight for people who are at the bottom of the pile, because we know that systemic and structural power exist. This is, I don't know if you will have heard of David Smale. He was a very influential psychologist. He died about 7 years ago. A very influential psychologist who throughout the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s wrote a lot about power and about whose interests are served in the way that healthcare services run. And he talked really about how power influences from upwards. So you have the dominant social, political, economic, and cultural climate. You have the influence of the media. They impact directly upon the domestic, occupational, educational systems we exist in. You know, my employer is the health service, who is clearly affected directly by the government and the economic system I live in. And all those things funnel down onto me. So actually, people are down at the bottom with all these influences crowding down upon them. And there's plenty of scope in all of these things for things to go wrong. Now, how we often do therapy is you've got a consulting room, and there's a therapist, and there's a client. And, you know, often we Sometimes this sort of model can result in what seems like some quite good outcomes. And that can be very gratifying. It's very motivating for the therapist. But actually, there are always these other people in the room, aren't there? And we know that. We do formulations, we talk about early experiences, so we take into account these things. That's not very radical, is it? But this is really how we should be thinking. And the important thing here is that in this version, the therapist and the client are the same size. They're as important as each other. They both have power and influence. In this version, the therapist is much smaller than everyone else. Because the reality is that if I see someone for an hour a week for 20 weeks, I have seen them for 20 hours. But there are 167 hours each week where I am not seeing them. And that is when they exist in their own world, where their family and friends and so on exist around them, and where they are at the mercy of their social environment. And if their social environment is good, good for them. If their social environment is negative or adverse or dangerous, this will be highly, highly influential. It's really, the same way that we know that you shouldn't do treatment for PTSD when the person is still in a threatening environment, because the social environment is actually much more influential, usually, than we are. That doesn't mean that our training and our knowledge is redundant or useless or it's a waste of everyone's time. I think that some humility from our professions would be useful, because we have to know our limits. And it's worth reflecting on why we're in these professions, why we've chosen to spend our lives working with damaged, traumatized, unhappy people, and what we get from working with those people. Because you don't just fall into this kind of work. It seeks us out, and we seek it out. But we are, at the end of the day, there for an hour a week for however many weeks. The person's world is bigger. And that is worth remembering. So David Smale, who put together this model, also put together this. And
sorry, just for 1 second. Is that...
Yes, please.
Okay, if we can just go back to the other model that you just put up, if it's okay, yeah. So here, the social environment here, you've got it as bigger than the client, which is really interesting. And I see how that is, especially with vulnerable clients. But can we empower clients so that actually they take control of their social environment, whether they sometimes can maybe change their environment if they can, or at least manage how the social environment impacts them, or even family, how much it impacts them. Sometimes we can't change our social environment, sometimes we can. And so can we make that circle of the client actually bigger so that while the social environment sometimes can be changed, other times it can't, but we still have control of how we deal with our social environment and family and the therapist and the significant others?
Yeah, of course the client can become bigger, but if we go back to this, how big can they get? Do you see what I mean? Because these things, these are bigger than all of us.
Yeah.
And so, yes, of course, ideally, the client becomes bigger and more powerful, and they have more agency and more confidence, and they can leave that abusive partner or that unhappy relationship, or they can, find other ways to exert some control over their lives again and feel less powerless. But ultimately, we all exist in this. And so we can become more powerful than many of these things, but not necessarily these things. To become more powerful than these things, well, that requires all of us to band together and fight for something bigger and better. That's a collectivist approach.
We've also seen that, I'm really sorry if I'm interrupting you.
No, please.
We've also seen that sometimes there have been so many cases where where clients or patients have been through very traumatic experiences and their social environment works against them, everything is against them, yet they find a way to actually take over the system and actually push their way through so that they begin to influence the system. But they have to be bigger in their own mind. They need to be bigger than that social environment to be able to then to challenge it and change it. And if they still feel smaller than the social environment, it's almost like, oh, that's a circle outside of me, I can't deal with it. Whereas if we empower the client to be bigger than the system, then that's when change of the system actually happens. And you've read these really inspiring books of people who have been at the worst of situation, and it's when we're at the lowest that it ignites that fire in people to actually create change.
Yeah, it can. And and I think there are some people who can do that. I think there are a lot of people who get very beaten down by life.
And what if that's the power of the therapist, that we can actually bring that client from that bottom pit that they feel they're in to actually become bigger than the social environment? That's when therapy has really worked its course and done its power.
Yeah, and when it does that, it's a magnificent thing. I don't know how often therapy does that, and I'm not saying that to sort of be provocative, but I don't know. The reality is that I don't work in a service that offers traditional psychological therapy, because my patients often have cognitive impairments, and as I say, they often have social problems. And there's a reason I work with those people, partly because I think like this, and partly because they're the kind of patients who I find in some ways the most enjoyable to work with. So I think that sometimes therapy can do that. I don't know how often it does. And also, I don't know how often we should expect it to. Therapy is one solution, and conventional therapy, one-on-one in a room, is a very specific kind of therapy. There's a psychologist, he's retired now, he's called Guy Holmes, and he wrote a book called Psychology in the Real World. And he's been on the radio, he's written a number of books and articles and so on. And he used to do psychological therapy with groups of people taking walks in the country, on the basis that when your body is moving, it affects how you feel physiologically. It affects endorphins, and they affect your mood, on the basis that walking in groups with people allows you to build friendships, allows you to make connections. It is less pathologizing, because you're just a bunch of people going out for a walk. You're not all sitting in a waiting room in a hospital, So there are ways to do it. Of course there are ways to do it, but we need to think laterally. And maybe the one-on-one model is not always the most effective, though for some people it can be highly effective. What I'm saying really is there's more than one way to skin a cat. And maybe our job is to have the breadth of thought and creativity and imagination that allows us to conceive of different ways. But it's not always easy for all sorts of reasons. It's not easy if you're doing WhatsApp therapy. It's not easy if you work in a highly regimented, structured healthcare service, which allows hardly any flexibility. But we're working with people. We need to be flexible, don't we, really? It's 9:15. I maybe won't talk about this stuff, and I maybe won't talk about this stuff. But these these are some of the things that might affect our experience of living, of being alive in the world. And actually, the extent to which our experiences of these things are positive or negative will influence what life is like for us. This is something I use when I'm teaching sometimes to help people think about the power they have, about some of their privilege, about the areas of their life where things are good and where things are bad. And sometimes I give people 2 copies of this and I say, show me what, well, not show me, but think about what this was like when you were little. And think about what it's like now when you're a highly qualified professional. And look at how life has changed for you and what that means for you in your material world. I don't use it with patients so much. I think the patients I work with would struggle with it. But I try to keep in mind these things, because when these things are good, when we have privilege, life could be quite good. If your health is poor and your physical environment is unsuitable, and you've been bullied a great deal and you're lacking in confidence, and you haven't got much money because you're unemployed because of disability, and you wanted to go to school, but your family couldn't afford for you to go to school because you had to leave when you were 12 and work, that's a really different life. What I'm saying really is we can only do the therapy we can do in the context that we work, because not everyone can take groups of patients off for a walk in the countryside every week. But in some ways, it doesn't matter. The point is to make sure we keep these things in mind so that we have a breadth of thought and we do what we can. Because ultimately, all we can do is all we can do. So I'm going to stop talking there. And if you have any thoughts, then please, very welcome to share them. I prefer conversation really to monologues.
Thank you, Masuma. That was absolutely brilliant, like everybody else is saying. And if Zubair was here, I would get him to do a Nara Haidari. At this point, none of us, the rest of us, I think, are too shy to do that. Unless, of course, we have a mass Nara Haidari right at the end. That would be quite nice. But, so many of your points that you've just said were just making me think about the kind of work that we do specifically in Iraq. Because, of course, we don't have those infrastructures in place. We don't have, there are so many difficulties like that we might take for granted here, like, just access to healthcare, like physical healthcare, access to GPs, access to mental health services, as kind of difficult as things are here, like some of the patients that you've talked about in terms of resources. But then just imagine how they are in Iraq, and kind of really from the basics, like not having anything at all, like no psychological therapy and no kind of structure for primary to secondary referral, no infrastructure for health. So I guess some of the challenges that you're talking about in terms of creativity, it really hits home with some of the things that we're having to do with kind of really think on the ground, local needs, what's really needed. Can we really just come along and say, here's our Western model of psychotherapy, and come there and kind of do a 50-minute session with them? Is that really what's needed? And I think, in recent days, we've had some really kind of good examples of working systemically, of looking at the bigger picture, looking at things contextually within the local situation on the ground. Abdullah just did a great piece of work in the past couple of weeks, just connecting different health professionals, for example, and that's what was needed, and kind of connecting health professionals from here to provide supervision for a high risk case. There's a really, really high risk case that had we'd been scratching our heads over for about 6 months just on this group, and she'd made 4 suicide attempts, and it was really tough for the therapists over there, who don't have this kind of training, and without supervision and without a team, without support, to manage, you know, such a vulnerable young woman. So I guess it really required a different kind of thinking about what is our role, what's really needed. And it was you know, few of like the team were involved in this. But yeah, it just makes me think. We had a meeting yesterday. We had a psychiatrist from Iraq. We had a systemic psychotherapist from here. Abdullah was in the meeting, and so was I, and we had one of our colleagues translating. And it was, you know, it's a really good. Thank you for the slides, Masuma. I will distribute them on the group. But yeah, it was a really good meeting. I guess what really kind of made it powerful and impacting was that we were trying to think creatively about a new way of working, so that the therapist in Iraq could be supported by a wider team. So we ended up, for example, arranging bi-monthly supervision for that therapist, and the psychiatrist locally would provide one supervision session, and the systemic psychotherapist from here would provide the other session. So it really required kind of a different way of thinking and just introducing a new way of working. And the systemic work completely, I couldn't agree more, especially in Iraq, like where collectivist society, you know, we couldn't work without working systemically.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no perfect system, is there? Just have to chip away as best you can. I think there's a hand up.
Yeah, that was me. I think the session today was very inspiring for me. And the thoughts that really made me that came up to my head are related to how much as therapists, it's not enough for us to have psychological knowledge, and how much we need to be good teachers and have different sets of skill sets that we need to transfer to our clients. And because it's like the general knowledge of, we need a general knowledge of life and knowing different aspects of life. Some clients, as you said, they will need housing, or they will need better something from social services, let's say, or career coaching, whereas others would need just like a psychological intervention. So it made me think about like the importance of working within a team, and also like having a diverse skill set that we can use to help our clients. And for some reason, also seeing the small circle, being the small therapist circle rather than the equal one, it got a lot of humility inside me. But it felt like good humility, you know, and it also slightly also lifts off a burden of you, because sometimes you can get overly invested in like, I need to make it work. I need to help this client. He doesn't have anyone else, or and then but then in the end, you're only, as you said, you see them 20 hours of the sessions, and that's it.
We're just people, you know. When we're not superhuman, we haven't got any magical skills or abilities. We're just people trying our best. And like I say, there's probably something about our personality styles that draws us to this kind of work. But ultimately, we're just people. And the danger of this kind of work is if it overwhelms you, because the well of human need is enormous. If it overwhelms you, well, that doesn't make us very effective at our jobs, because we have to survive this. It's not very easy working with people in Iraq who have PTSD. It's not very easy working with poor people with aggressive brain tumors in East London. It's not easy work. It's actually incredibly exhausting, draining work. And I actually think it's really helpful to remember that we're just people trying our best. And we can't fix, individual people cannot fix systemic problems. Systems have to change. We can agitate those systems. We can fight against them. We can fight for something better. Or to fight for something, not just against a thing you don't like. But ultimately, systems change only comes about when people who are of a similar mindset help each other to fight for something better.
Thank you very much for today.
My pleasure. Thank you. I know it probably wasn't the most orthodox formulation session, but you know, this is the stuff I know, and this is the stuff I believe, and this is what I think is important about clinical practice.
We have Selma has a question. Yeah. Okay. Annie, you go.
Oh, no, I just said there's a question on the chat.
Do self-care. Oh gosh. Well, I do a lot outside my day job, some of which is about systems change. So I have a role in my professional body, which allows me to do the bigger systems stuff. And I can talk to quite influential people about changing things that need to change. And I find that highly motivating. But aside from that, I spend a lot of time outdoors. And I do woodwork, actually, because this is all very cerebral stuff, you know? And actually, it's quite nice to use the muscles below the neck. So that's what I do, because creativity is important. And sometimes there's something very nice about making something out of wood. Because remember that we have, for most of human history, have worked the earth, grown food, carved our own bowls and spoons and so on, and been in contact with nature. And I actually think that finding ways to be in contact with nature is probably what allows us to keep going. And it gives you space to think, of course. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I'm sorry. Did you have more things to say? I was to say I had another question when you're finished.
No, I'm finished, please.
So I wanted to ask you, because you said you seem to work with a lot of communities, and I can't help but notice that you're like muhajjabi, like us in the UK. What are your thoughts about the mental health within our community, like now? And have you done work in that? How do you think we can help?
I have done some work with Muslim communities. I think that, like many communities, we have intergenerational trauma. You know, many of us came to the UK because of some form of persecution or genocide or war. Many of us in our homelands were colonized for centuries and centuries. You know, my family are ethnically Indian, and they were colonized first by the Mughals, then by the British. And I think that does a lot of harm to a culture, to citizens. And you know, we don't really talk about intergenerational trauma in diaspora communities, certainly not South Asian diaspora communities. I don't know if we have the language for it yet, but I think quite a lot about, for about 5 years, I've been thinking of writing a paper about the impact of centuries of colonization and intergenerational trauma on South Asian diaspora populations. I've never quite got round to it, but I think we have huge amounts of need, and I don't think we're very good at identifying it.
Okay, thank you again.
It's coming up to 9 o'clock. Were there any final questions or comments? Shall we let Masuma have dinner now?
I should let you have dinner.
Masuma, incredibly enriching, as always. Alhamdulillah. We take away a great deal from today's session. And yeah, really beneficial in so many ways, and really stretching our minds in terms of creativity and thinking differently about where our input could be most effective. So I'm always grateful to you and really, really highly appreciative of all the work you're doing. So thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you, of course, for your questions and your comments, because there's nothing worse than talking into the void for an hour and a half.
No, we're absolutely delighted to join in and give you our whatever's on our mind, and of course what you're feeding our minds as well. So really, really delighted to be interactive. And I'm sticking around for anyone else who wants to stick around. Otherwise, Masuma, thank you so much.
Not at all. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Masuma. Thank you.
Maslama.